Hey, before we get started, I want to let you know about Buzzsprout podcast hosting. Right now, you can get a free $20 Amazon gift card when you sign up for any of their paid plans. It's what I use to host this podcast, but it's also what I recommend because they're extremely easy to use. They have really fair pricing. They price per hour instead of megabytes. It's free to start, so you get up to 90 days for free if you want. Customer support is really quick and awesome. You get a nice website player that you can embed. You get a nice website as well. They are constantly coming out with new features. They just added an affiliate marketplace. They are about to update their stats, and they've done a ton of stuff just in the last year. So I highly recommend them, and you can go to buzzsproutdeal.com to get that free $20 Amazon gift card when you sign up for one of their plans. So again, that's buzzsproutdeal.com. Hey, so whether you are just starting a podcast or you already have one, you definitely need to get your own domain name. And what that is the .com basically. So either podcastingsimplified.com or podcastinsights.com is the domain name. And what you really don't want is the built-in name that your podcast host gives you. So thebestpodcast.libsyn.com, for example, or bestpodcast.podbean.com. So instead you want thebestpodcast.com, nice and simple. And not only is the second version easier to remember and share, it's easier to say, and you're not also promoting another company that you probably are already paying in the process. So I think it costs about $10 a year to get a domain name. So not a lot of cost, and it's pretty easy to set up too. So a quick note though, you can't actually register your podcast name in iTunes or Spotify or platforms like that. So you'll want to get a domain name to really own that name and that space. And you also can register your name on Facebook and Twitter and other places like that to really kind of secure those assets as well. Now, we'll walk through a few ways to register a domain name. And then at the end, I'm actually going to highlight some tips for choosing a podcast domain name that you'll want to definitely stay for. So let's get into it. The first way to register a domain name is with a company called Namecheap. They're the one I recommend. They're called a domain registrar, and there's actually lots of these. There's Hover, there's GoDaddy is a common one that you may have heard of. There's name.com, who happens to be based here in Colorado where I live. So I tend to use them, but I really like Namecheap. And then I actually have a whole blog post on this as well. So I'll leave it in the show description, and you can check out all this stuff in written form. I have some images in there as well. So be sure and check that out too. But what you do is go to namecheap.com and you'll see just a search bar, and then you type in the name that you want. If it's available, you just click add to cart, and then you can continue. There is an option though that I want to highlight that I make sure you add. It's called WhoisGuard. It's basically Whois privacy. So when you register a domain name, your public or your name, phone number, and address are listed with that name. And if you don't add this WhoisGuard, Whois privacy, then that info is public, and you'll tend to get a lot of spam calls and mail and stuff. And it's people basically trying to scam you is what I find happens a lot. So I recommend just adding that. And with Namecheap, it's actually free, at least for the first year. And otherwise, it's only a few dollars a year to add it to avoid those annoying phone calls and mail. So real, snail mail. So I highly recommend adding that, and, continue through the process, create an account and pay, and you'll be all set up. But you will need to change something called DNS settings to point to your podcast hosting company. So they'll have instructions on how to do that. There's usually a CNAME setting that you just point to your .buzzsprout.com domain name. And then when you say thebestpodcast.com, it actually points to that location kind of behind the scenes. You don't need to worry about how all that works. Just know that there's just one little setting that you have to set up. And then if you don't plan on using the built-in website from your podcast hosting company, and maybe you plan on creating a WordPress site, then you can many times get a free domain name when you sign up for a web hosting plan. And so I recommend Bluehost for this. And there's actually a search bar on the blog post here, but you can just type in a name, and when you go to sign up, you'll get your domain name for free when you sign up for hosting. So a nice little bonus if that's something you plan on doing already. Now we'll move into the tips for choosing a podcast domain name. So a few that I think are really important. So the first one is go with a .com, and there isn't a .podcast extension right now, and there's some popularity rising around .fm, but I think I would just go with .com because most people are familiar with it, and if they can't remember, then they might just type that in by default because it's so common. So if you can, go with a .com. The next tip is to avoid dashes and underscores in your name. So for one, these just look bad, and I even think they look a little shady, like you're, I don't know, up to no good. Maybe that's the industry I came from, but they're just kind of hard to remember anyway. And it's difficult to say out loud on your podcast. So the-best-podcast.com just doesn't have the same ring as the bestpodcast.com. So avoid dashes and underscores. The next one is just to add podcast to the end of your name. So, a lot of names are already taken, which just kind of the nature of it. So if you add podcast to the end of your name, there'll be a lot better chance of it being available. So just a little tip there to try to find something. And then the next tip is to keep it short. So I know if you add podcast to the end, it might make it a little longer. That's okay. It's still, I think, fairly easy to remember, but the fewer the words, the better, and it's easier to say and easier to remember. So keep it as short as possible. The next tip is to don't pigeonhole yourself. So be mindful of how narrow your domain name is. One example that I heard not too long ago was the Art of Charm podcast, which is really popular, but they had a difficult time talking about topics beyond dating and other kind of self-improvement topics because their name just sounded like a dating type podcast. So just something to be mindful of. You can try to go a little broader to play it safe as you continue to podcast, continue to grow, and talk about new topics that will kind of allow that to happen. And maybe you want to use your real name if you're talking, it's a podcast more about you and what you're doing, use your name, and then you can talk about kind of anything you want. So one tip there. And then avoid copyrights. So be careful not to use a name that infringes on someone else's copyright or trademark. You can do searches for this, but be careful because people can force you to take it down. And if you don't comply with that, they can actually sue you. So just try to do a few searches before you go and register your domain name to make sure that you're not infringing on anyone's copyright. And kind of if that happens, then you might have to redo your entire podcast brand and artwork and intros and everything. So it will just become a hassle. So those are the tips for choosing a podcast domain name and how to register your domain name at a few different places. So go ahead and check out the show description for links to this blog post and some links over to Namecheap and Bluehost if you want to hop right over there. But that is all I have for today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.